Hello, welcome back to another Pen Talk. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining me as I explore the wide world of pens. And this video is going to take a little way back trip and look at a vintage pen. Even though I have a phenomenal amount of vintage pens that I've collected over 50 some years, they still appeal to me. I still watch eBay and I watch auctions, and this pen showed up and I was able to win the auction with what I thought was a reasonable bid for this pen. Here's the auction that I won. And also I wanted to mention that the seller sells a lot of vintage pens. Here's a recent listing, and people a lot of times ask on social media, oh, I'd like to get a vintage pen, where can I get one? And I think that the seller sells good vintage at good prices. They're not perfect, but they are functional, they do work, and to me that's the important part. So we're going to explore this pen, talk about its relatives, talk about some of its history, and obviously we're going to put nib to paper. There's no crab, just a little stand. So the first thing is this is a small pen. Not petite, but certainly small. It has that classic Parker design. If we hopefully try to get the engraving here, we'll get some indication as to what it is. And it's a Parker Victory. It's made in England. Gremia Pens have done a lot of reviews on these Victory pens. This is, I think, in the latter series of those pens. Small cap band with some interesting geometric designs. The cap comes off in about 1 1/4 turns, and we'll see why I bought the pen was because of the nib. The red one of these I have, which we'll look at a little bit later, has also a very nice nib on it. These pens from the 50s, both Watermans and Parkers that were made in England, I think they have phenomenal nibs, nice ebonite feeds. Yeah, there's a fair amount of tipping material on there. And they also are a little soft. Not super flexy, but just has that nice bounce that I like. The pen can be written with unposted. That section's a little small, but you can hold it anywhere. And as we would suspect based on this design, it posts extremely well. It feels good in the hand posted, and it looks good in the hand posted. So let's take a look at some of its cousins and brothers and sisters. Let's see what ink I want to put in here and see how it writes. The other thing that marks this pen from the 50s is the filling system. You know, the barrel unscrews and we'll see that Parker Aerometric filler. You know, if we were to pull this in another pen, I pulled out the nib and feed, there's a breather tube in here. There's a silicone sac, which the more I read about them, they're semi-permeable, so ink will evaporate from these. Latex is better from that viewpoint, but then these are kind of inert, so you're not going to get that latex discoloration. And it's an interesting engraving on here. Yeah, Parker labeled everything and also let you know what you needed to do to fill the pen. And all these things work very, very well. I had to do a little bit more flushing on this. I'm going to clean up the little gunk around the threads. And the other thing that I noticed was there's a little bit of teeth marks on the end of the barrel. But this, to me, is typical of what I would call used vintage. It's not going to be perfect. And for those that are in the vintage market, yeah, you can buy a perfect pen and you can pay a phenomenal amount of money with it. But to me, I want a writing instrument, so I don't mind a little bit of wear and tear as long as it functions well as a writing instrument. So here's some pens we're going to compare. So this is another Victory, same model, just a different color. This is a slim fold, not called a Victory, even though it could be called like a small Victory. And as a reference, here's a Conway Stewart. And this is not a typical Conway Stewart in my mind. So the first thing you'll notice has a pull-off cap, and then it has that strange nib that's partly covered. But it also has an aerometric filler. And this is a pen from the 60s. It was a lower-end Conway Stewart. Here's one I would put more in the range of the 50s. And obviously, a much nicer, well-made pen. A great nib, similar to what we're finding on the Parkers. But Waterman was not standing by the wayside. This is a W5, which again is from the 50s. Beautiful design. I do think this is the winner of this group. And it also has a phenomenal nice nib on it. So it's kind of like that history. Other thing you might talk about is the evolution of pricing. So we'll give you the pricing of the pens that I paid. Shipping varied, so most of these came from the UK, so I paid between $10 and $15 of shipping on top of the pen costs. But definitely, vintage has certainly gone up in price, at least some of the ones I'm finding on eBay. This was a real bargain. This was a real bargain. I didn't even do anything with this pen because I don't think it's worth reviewing. And this pen was $10. There's buys to be found if you look. So what ink to use? Well, this ink I'd been saving for a special pen, also vintage, but I've decided that I'm going to put it in the Victory pen. It's just a CP ink, and I'm thinking it's going to emulate some vintage writing. Sepia is in the brown family. Not certain how you determine it's a sepia. It's definitely looks like a red and a blue combination. No water resistance. Let's see how it works in that Parker Victory. So filling it worked exactly as described. 5 squeezes, and I got a pretty full fill. I mean, we got ink from here to here, so that's a fair amount of ink in there. And that to me is one of the advantages of this filling mechanism, is you can put a fair amount of ink into a vintage pen. I'm ready for the writing portion of this review. So the ink works well in this pen. No spoilers alert. I don't post when I do my writing samples because it has a tendency to hit the tripod because I'm writing over the camera. We'll give you the dimensions of the section. We'll give you the overall dimensions of the pen in the normal way. Well, my new improved version of the dimensions. And then we'll put ink to paper. So my first impressions are, I like the nib. It's exactly what I expected. You get a little bit of feedback, but it flows well, and you get a little bit of bounce. You know, that's like almost extra fine line. The downstrokes are a little wider because it does have a certain of a stub characteristic to it. If you put a little bit of pressure on the downstrokes, it'll open up and you get a lot more ink flow. But that's as much as you're going to push it. At least I'm going to push it. This is just a great everyday writer. And I think this Aurora Sepia ink looks great in this pen. So I generally don't rate vintage, but we're going to give this a rating. I'm going to give it a 9.4. It gets 2 checks for the nib. And then it just gets 1 check for It's a classic design, it's a classic look, it's extremely representative of its time period, and it's in pretty good condition. So I hope you've enjoyed this little look at an interesting vintage pen. I'd say on the edge of vintage. And it's a great writer. I think the price was reasonable. So I hope this video finds you safe, healthy, and happy, enjoying your pens, putting ink on paper. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you have a great day, week, month, year. Enjoy every one of them. We've reached the end, and we're going to say bye. Nice writer, nice ink.